The Great Brinks Robbery was an armed robbery of the Brinks building in the north end of Boston, Massachusetts, on the 17th of January 1950. The 2.7 million, which would be equivalent to 33.8 million today, theft consisted of around 1.2 million in cash and 1.5 million in checks, money orders, and other securities. It was at the time the largest robbery in the history of the United States and has been called the crime of the century. The robbery remained unsolved for nearly 6 years until estranged group member Joseph O'Keefe testified only days before the statute of limitations would have expired. Of the 11 people involved in the robbery, 8 would receive life sentences after the trial, and 2 of the others passing away before they could be convicted. Less than 60,000 of the more than 2.7 million stolen would never be recovered. The robbery received significant press coverage and was eventually adapted into 4 movies. The perpetrators consisted of Joseph McGinnis. According to O'Keefe's testimony, McGinnis was the mastermind behind the robbery. However, this was later disputed by Geoghegan. He was responsible for destroying incriminating evidence, including guns, the truck, and clothes. McGinnis died in prison on the 5th of October 1966. Joseph Specs O'Keefe. O'Keefe died in March 1976 at the age of 67. Anthony Pino. According to Geoghegan, Pino was the leader of the gang. Pino died in October 1973 at the age of 67. Adolph Jazz Maffei. Maffei died in September 1988 at the age of 77. He was the last surviving member of the robbery. Thomas Sandy Richardson. Richardson died in 1980 at the age of 73. Vincent Costa. Costa was released from prison in 1969 after being paroled. He was arrested again in 1985 and was charged with cocaine trafficking. Michael Geoghegan. Geoghegan was released in 1969 after being paroled. Henry Baker. Baker died in prison in 1961 at the age of 54. James Faherty. Faherty, along with Geoghegan and Maffei, was released in 1969 after being paroled. Joseph Banfield. Banfield died in 1955 at the age of 45. Stanley Gusara. Gusara died in July 1953 of a brain tumour before he could be tried for his role in the robbery. The robbery was first conceived in 1947. However, in 1948, after months of planning, the group learned that Brinks had moved to a new location. While the theft was originally intended to be a burglary rather than an armed robbery, they could not find a way around the building's burglar alarm. After observing the movements of the guards, they decided that the robbery should take place after 7 p.m, as the vault would be open and fewer guards would be on duty. After a period of several months, the robbers removed each lock from the building and had a key made for it before returning the lock. 2 vehicles were stolen, a truck to carry away the loot from the robbery, and a car which would be used to block any pursuit. Vincent Costa was the group's lookout and signalled with a flashlight from a nearby rooftop when he saw the vault being opened. After 5 aborted runs, Costa finally gave the go-ahead on the night of the 17th of January 1950. At the outset, very few facts were available to the investigators. From interviews with the 5 employees, it was learned that between 5 and 7 robbers had entered the building. The robbers did little talking. They moved with a studied precision, which suggested the crime had been carefully planned and rehearsed. The criminals had opened at least 3, possibly 4 doors to gain entrance to the 2nd floor, where employees of the security firm Brinks, Inc. in Boston, Massachusetts were closing for the day, returning sacks of undelivered cash, checks, and other materials to the company safe on the 2nd floor. Shortly before 7:30 p.m, they were surprised by 5 men, heavily disguised and wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and soft shoes to muffle noise. At 7:10 p.m, they entered the building and tied up 5 employees working in the vault area. The employees had been forced at gunpoint to lie face down on the floor. Their hands were tied behind their backs and adhesive tape was pulled over their mouths. Immediately following the robbery, Police Commissioner Thomas F. Sullivan sent a mobilization order for all precinct captains and detectives. 13 people were detained in the hours following the robbery, including 2 former employees of Brinks. Brinks offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of these involved, and the additional 5% of recovered cash offered by the insurance company. Director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, took over supervision of the investigation. The only physical evidence left at the scene was a cap, tape, and rope used to bind the employees. The FBI further learned that 4 revolvers had been taken. The descriptions and serial numbers of these weapons were carefully noted since they might prove a valuable link to the men responsible for the crime. Since Brinks was located in a heavily populated tenement section, many hours were consumed in interviews to locate people who might have information of possible value. A systematic check of the current and past Brinks employees was undertaken. Personnel of the 3-story building housing of the Brinks offices were questioned. Inquiries were made concerning salesmen, messengers, and others who had called at Brinks and might know its physical layout as well as its operational procedures. An immediate effort was also made to obtain descriptive data concerning the missing cash and securities. All identifying marks placed on currency and securities by customers were noted, and appropriate stops were placed at banking institutions across the nation. Brinks customers were contacted for information regarding the packaging and shipping materials they used. Most of the cash stolen was in denominations of $1 to $20, which made it nearly impossible to trace the bills through serial numbers. Any information police could get from their informers initially proved useless. The truck that the robbers had used was found cut in pieces in Stockton, Massachusetts, near O'Keefe's home. In June 1950, O'Keefe and Gusara were arrested in Pennsylvania for burglary. O'Keefe was sentenced to 3 years in Bradford County Jail and Gusara to 5 to 20 years in Western State Penitentiary in Pittsburgh. Police heard through their informers that O'Keefe and Gusara demanded money from Pino and McGinnis in Boston to fight their convictions. It was later claimed that most of O'Keefe's share went to his legal defence. FBI agents tried to talk to O'Keefe and Gusara in prison, but the two professed ignorance of the Brinks robbery. Other members of the group came under suspicion, but there was not enough evidence for an indictment, so law enforcement kept pressure on the suspects. After O'Keefe was released, he was taken to stand trial for another burglary and parole violations and was released on bail of $17,000. O'Keefe later claimed that he had never seen his portion of the loot after he had given it to Maffei for safekeeping. Apparently, in need of money, he kidnapped Vincent Costa and demanded his part of the loot for ransom. Pino paid a small ransom but then decided to try to unalive O'Keefe. After a couple of attempts, he hired underworld hitman Elmer Trigger Burke to do the job. Burke travelled to Boston and shot O'Keefe, seriously wounding him but failing to unalive him. The FBI approached O'Keefe in the hospital, and on the 6th of January 1956, he decided to talk. On the 12th of January 1956, just days before the statute of limitations ran out, the FBI arrested Barker, Costa, Geegan, Maffei, McGinnis and Pino. They apprehended Flaherty and Richardson on the 16th of May in Dorchester. O'Keefe pleaded guilty on the 18th of January. Gusara passed away on the 9th of July. Banfield had already passed. A trial began on the 6th of August 1956. 8 of the men received maximum sentences of life imprisonment. All were paroled by 1971 except McGinnis, who passed away in prison. O'Keefe received 4 years and was released in 1960. Only $58,000 of the $2.7 million was recovered. The 4 films that were made and inspired by the robbery were Six Bridges to Cross, made in 1955 by Joseph Purvney, Blueprint for Robbery in 1961 by Jerry Hopper, Brinks, The Great Robbery in 1976 by Marvin J. Komsky, and lastly, The Brinks Job in 1978 by William Friedkin. The Brinks case was front-page news. Even before Brinks Incorporated offered the reward, the case had captured the imagination of millions of Americans. Many types of information were received. Many tips were received from anonymous people. On a night exactly 2 years after the crime occurred, the FBI's Boston office received an anonymous telephone call from an individual who claimed he was sending a letter identifying the Brinks robbers. Information received from this individual linked 9 people to the crime. After careful checking, the FBI eliminated 8 of the suspects. He later was arrested as a member of the robbery. Of the hundreds of suspects contacted by FBI agents in the weeks immediately following the robbery, few were willing to be interviewed. In its determination to overlook no possibility, the FBI contacted various resorts throughout the United States for information concerning persons known to possess unusually large sums of money following the robbery. Racetracks and gambling establishments were also covered in the hope of finding some of the loot in circulation. This phase of the investigation greatly disturbed many gamblers. A number of them discontinued their operations, others indicated a strong desire that the robbers be identified and apprehended. The mass of information gathered during the early weeks of the investigation was continuously sifted. All efforts to identify the men through the evidence which had been left in Brinks proved unsuccessful. On the 5th of February 1950, a police officer in Somersville, Massachusetts, recovered one of the 4 revolvers that had been taken by the robbers. Investigation established that the weapon, together with another rusty revolver, had been found on the 4th of February 1950 by a group of boys who were playing on a sandbar near the edge of the Mystic River in Somerville. Shortly after these 2 weapons were found, one of them was placed in a trash barrel and the other was taken to the city dump. The other weapon was picked up by the officer and identified as being taken during the Brinks robbery. A detailed search for additional weapons was made at the Mystic River. The results were negative. The FBI learned that a 1949 green Ford snake body truck with a canvas top had been parked near the Prince Street door of Brinks at approximately the time of the robbery. On the 4th of March 1950, pieces of an identical truck were found at a dump in Stockton, Massachusetts. An acetylene torch had been used to cut up the truck, and it appeared that a sledgehammer had also been used to smash many of the heavy parts, such as the motor. The truck pieces were concealed in fibre bags when found. The truck found at the dump had been reported stolen from a Ford dealer near Fenway Park in Boston on the 3rd of November 1949. Nonetheless, the finding of the truck parts at Stockton, Massachusetts was to prove a valuable break in the investigation. 2 of the participants in the robbery lived in the Stockton area. After the truck parts were found, additional suspicion was attached to these men. Among the early suspects was Anthony Pino, who had been a principal suspect in numerous major robberies and burglaries in Massachusetts. Pino had been questioned as to his whereabouts and provided a good alibi. The alibi was strong, but not conclusive. 2 of the prime suspects whose experience suited them for the Brinks robbery were Joseph James O'Keefe and Stanley Albert Gusara. O'Keefe and Gusara reportedly had worked together on a number of occasions. Like Gusara, O'Keefe was known to have associated with Pino prior to the Brinks robbery. Both suspects had been questioned by Boston authorities following the robbery. Neither had a convincing alibi. In April 1950, the FBI received information indicating that part of the Brinks loot was hidden in the home of a relative of O'Keefe's in Boston. A federal search warrant was obtained and the home was searched by agents on the 27th of April 1950. Several hundreds of dollars were found hidden in the house but could not be identified as part of the loot. On the 8th of September 1950, O'Keefe was sentenced to 3 years in the Bradford County Jail at Towanda and fined $3,000 for violation of the Uniform Firearms Act. Although Gusara was acquainted of the charges against him in Towanda, he was removed to McKean County, Pennsylvania, to stand trial for burglary, larceny, and receiving stolen goods. On the 11th of October 1950, Gusara was sentenced to serve 5 to 20 years in the Western Pennsylvania Penitentiary at Pittsburgh. Even after these convictions, O'Keefe and Gusara continued to seek their release. Despite the lack of evidence and witnesses upon which court proceedings could be based, as the investigation progressed, there was little doubt that O'Keefe had been one of the central figures in the Brinks robbery. Pino was also linked with the robbery, and there was every reason to suspect that O'Keefe felt Pino was turning his back on him now that O'Keefe was in jail. O'Keefe and gusara had been interviewed on several occasions concerning the Brinks robbery, but they had claimed complete ignorance. FBI agents again visited gusara and O'Keefe. There was Adolf Jazz Maffey, who was allegedly being pressured to contribute money for the legal battle of O'Keefe and gusara against Pennsylvania authorities. He'd been questioned concerning his whereabouts and he was unable to provide any specific account of where he had been. At the time of Henry Barker's release from prison for breaking and entering and larceny, and for possession of burglar tools in 1959, Pino was on hand to drive him back to Boston. Since he claimed to have met no one and to have stopped nowhere during his walk, he actually could have been doing anything on the night of the crime. Prominent among the other strong suspects was Vincent James Costa, brother-in-law of Pino. Costa claimed that after working at the motor terminal until approximately 5 p.m, he had gone home to eat dinner, and then at approximately 7 p.m, he had left to return to the terminal and had worked until about 9 p.m. The FBI's analysis of the alibis offered by the suspects shows that the hour of 7 p.m. was frequently mentioned. O'Keefe had left his hotel at approximately 7 p.m. Pino and Baker separately decided to go out at 7 p.m. Costa started back at the motor terminal at about 7 p.m. Other principal suspects were not able to provide a very convincing account of their activities that evening. Since the robbery had taken place between approximately 10 past 7 and 27 minutes past 7 p.m, it was quite probable that the men, as well drilled as the bank robbers obviously were, would have arranged to rendezvous at a specific time. By fixing this time as close as possible to the minute at which the robbery was to begin, the robbers would have alibis to cover their activities up to the final moment. Soon after O'Keefe's return in March of 1954, Baker and his wife left Boston on a vacation. O'Keefe paid his respects to the other men in Boston on several occasions in the spring of 1954, and it was obvious to the agents handling the investigation that he was trying to solicit money. He was so cold and persistent in these dealings with his co-conspirators that agents hoped that he might be attempting to obtain a large sum of money, perhaps his share. O'Keefe had renewed his association with a Boston racketeer who had actively solicited funds for the defence of O'Keefe and gusara in 1950. It was reported that on the 18th of May 1954, O'Keefe and his racketeer associate took Vincent Costa to a hotel room and held him for several $1,000s ransom. Allegedly, the other members arranged for O'Keefe to be paid a small part of the ransom he demanded, and Costa was released on the 20th of May 1954. Special agents subsequently interviewed Costa and his wife, Pino and his wife, the racketeer, and O'Keefe. All denied any knowledge of the alleged incident. Nonetheless, several members of Brinks were visibly shaken and appeared to be abnormally worried during the latter part of May and the early part of June 1954. 2 weeks of comparative quiet in the member's life was shattered on the 5th of June 1954 when an attempt was made on O'Keefe's life. There were reports that a car had pulled on alongside O'Keefe's car in Dorchester, Massachusetts during the early morning hours of June 5th. Apparently suspicious, O'Keefe crouched low in the front seat of his car as the would-be assassins fired bullets that pierced the windshield. A second shooting incident occurred in the morning of the 14th of June 1954 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, when O'Keefe and his racketeer friend paid a visit to Baker. By this time, Baker was alleged to be nervous. Allegedly, he pulled a gun on O'Keefe. Several shots were exchanged by the two men, but none of the bullets found their mark. Then Baker fled. A third attempt on O'Keefe's life was made on the 16th of June 1954. This incident also took place in Dorchester and involved the firing of more than 30 shots. O'Keefe was wounded in the wrist and chest, but again he managed to escape with his life. After being wounded, O'Keefe disappeared. Police who arrived to investigate found a large amount of blood, a man's shattered wristwatch, and a .45 caliber pistol at the scene. 5 bullets which had missed their mark were found in a building nearby. On the 17th of June 1954, the Boston police arrested Elmer Trigger Burke and charged him with possession of a machine gun. Subsequently, this machine gun was identified as having been used in the attempt on O'Keefe's life. Burke, a professional unaliver, allegedly had been hired to assassinate O'Keefe. On the 1st of August 1954, he was arrested at Leicester, Massachusetts, and turned over to Boston police, who held him for violating probation on a gun-carrying charge. O'Keefe was sentenced on the 5th of August 1954 to serve 27 months in prison. As a protective measure, he was incarcerated in the Hampton County Jail at Springfield, Massachusetts, rather than the Suffolk County Jail in Boston. O'Keefe's racketeer associate, who allegedly had assisted him in holding Costa for ransom and was present during the shooting scrape between O'Keefe and Baker, disappeared on the 3rd of August 1954. The missing racketeer's car was found near his home, however his whereabouts remain a mystery. It's generally speculated that the racketeer was unalived because of his association with O'Keefe. James Faherty, an armed robbery specialist whose name had been mentioned in conversations in January 1950 concerning a score on which men used binoculars to watch their intended victims count large sums of money. Faherty had been questioned on the night of the robbery. He claimed to have been drinking in various taverns from approximately 10 past 5 p.m. until 7:45 p.m. Some people claimed to have seen him. Continuous investigation, however, had linked him with a gang. In 1936 and 1937, Faherty was convicted of armed robbery violations. Due to unsatisfactory conduct, drunkenness, refusal to seek employment, and association with well-known criminals, his parole was revoked. He was then returned to Massachusetts State Prison. 7 months later, however, he was again paroled. McGinnis had been arrested at the site of a still in New Hampshire in February 1954. Charged with unlawful possession of liquor distillery equipment and violation of internal revenue laws. His trial in March 1955 on the liquor charge resulted in a sentence of up to 30 days imprisonment and a fine of $1,000. In 1955, an upper court overruled the conviction on the grounds that the search and seizure of the still was illegal. Adolph Maffei, who had been convicted of income tax violation in June 1954, was released from the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury, Connecticut on the 30th of January 1955. 2 days before Maffei's release, another strong suspect passed of natural causes. There were recurring rumours that Joseph Sylvester Banfield had been right down there on the night of the crime. Banfield had been a close associate of McGinnis for many years. Although he had been known to carry a weapon, burglary rather than armed robbery was his criminal speciality, and with his exceptional driving skills, was an invaluable asset during the criminal getaways. Like the others, Banfield had been questioned concerning his activities on the night. He was not able to provide a specific account, claiming that he became drunk on New Year's Eve and remained intoxicated through the entire month of January. One of his former girlfriends who recalled having seen him on the night of the robbery stated that he definitely was not drunk. Even Pino, whose deportation troubles were a heavy burden, was arrested by the Boston police in August 1954. On the afternoon of the 28th of August 1954, Trigger Burke escaped from Suffolk County Jail in Boston, where he was being held on the gun possession charge arising from the most recent shooting of O'Keefe. On the 29th of August 1954, the officers' suspicions were aroused by a car that circled the general facility of an abandoned car on 5 occasions. This vehicle was traced through motor vehicle records to Pino. On the 30th of August, he was taken into custody as a suspicious person. Pino admitted being in the area, claiming that he was looking for a parking place so that he could visit a relative in hospital. After denying any knowledge of the escape of Trigger Burke, Pino was released. Despite the fact that substantial amounts of money were being spent by members of his associates during 1954 in defending themselves against legal proceedings alone, the year ended without a location of any of the bills as part of the loot. In addition, although violent dissension had developed within the gang, there was still no indication that any of the men were ready to talk. Based on the available information, the FBI felt that O'Keefe's disgust was reaching the point where it could be possible he would turn against his Confederates. During an interview with him in jail in Springfield, Massachusetts in October 1954, special agents found the missing Boston racketeer was weighing on O'Keefe's mind. In December 1954, he indicated to the agents that Pino could look for rough treatment if he, O'Keefe, again was released. From his cell in Springfield, O'Keefe wrote bitter letters to his associates and persisted his demands for money. The conviction for burglary in McKean County, Pennsylvania, still hung over his head, and legal fees remained to be paid. During 1955, O'Keefe carefully pondered his position. It appeared to him that he would spend the remaining days of his life in prison, while his co-conspirators would have many years to enjoy the luxuries of life. Even if released, he thought his days were numbered. There had been 3 attempts on his life in June 1954, and his frustrated assassins undoubtedly were waiting for him to return to Boston. Evidently resigned to long years in prisons or a short life on the outside, O'Keefe grew increasingly bitter towards his old associates. Through long weeks of empty promises of assistance and deliberate stalling by them, he began to realise that his threats were falling on deaf ears. As long as he was in prison, he could do no physical harm to his Boston criminal associates. And the members felt that the chances of him talking were negligible because he would be implicated along with the others. 2 days after Christmas 1955, FBI agents paid another visit to O'Keefe. After a period of hostility, he began to display a friendly attitude. Interviewed again on the 28th of December 1955, he talked somewhat more freely, and it was obvious that agents were gradually winning his respect and confidence. At 4:30 p.m. on the 6th of January 1956, O'Keefe made his final decision. He was through with Pino, Baker, McGinnis, Maffei, and his other conspirators who had turned against him. "All right," he told FBI agents, "what do you want to know?" In a series of interviews during the succeeding days, O'Keefe related the full story of the Brinks robbery. After each interview, FBI agents worked feverishly into the night checking all parts of the story which were subject to verification. Many of the details had previously been obtained during the intense 6-year investigation. Other information provided by O'Keefe helped to fill in the gaps which still existed. The following is a brief account of the data which O'Keefe provided to the special agents in January 1956. Although basically the brainchild of Pino, the Brinks robbery was the product of the combined thought and criminal experience of men who had known each other for many years. Serious consideration originally had been given to robbing Brinks in 1947, when Brinks was located on Federal Street in Boston. At the time, Pino approached O'Keefe and asked if he wanted to be in on the score. His close associate, Stanley Gusara, had previously been recruited, and O'Keefe agreed to take part. The members at the time included all the participants of the 1950 robbery except Henry Baker. The plan was to enter the Brinks building and take a truck containing payrolls. Many payrolls and dangers were involved in such a robbery, and the plans never crystallised. In December 1948, Brinks moved from Federal Street to 165 Prince Street in Boston. Almost immediately, the men began laying new plans. The roofs of buildings on Prince and Snow Hill Streets soon were alive with inconspicuous activity as the men looked for the most advantageous sites to observe what transpired inside Brinks' offices. Binoculars were used in this phase of the casting operation. Before the robbery was carried out, all of the participants were well acquainted with the Brinks premises. Each of them had surreptitiously entered the premises on several occasions after the employees had left for the day. During their attack inside the building, men took the lock cylinders from 5 doors, including one opening onto Prince Street. While some of the men remained in the building to ensure no one detected their operation, other men quickly obtained the keys to fit the locks. Then the lock cylinders were replaced. Investigation to substantiate this information resulted in the location of a proprietor of a key shop who recalled making keys for Pino on at least 4 to 5 evenings in the fall of 1949. Pino previously had arranged for this man to keep his shop open beyond the normal closing time on nights when Pino requested him to do so. Pino would take the locks to the man's shop and the keys would be made for them. This man subsequently identified the locks from the doors which the men had entered as similar to being the locks which Pino had brought to him. This man claimed to have no knowledge of Pino's involvement in the Brinks robbery. Each of the 5 cylinders was taken on a separate occasion. The removal of the lock cylinder from the outside door involved the greatest risk of detection. A passerby might notice that it was missing. Inside the building, the men carefully studied all available information concerning Brinks' schedules and shipments. The casting operation was so thorough that the criminals could determine the type of activity taking place in the Brinks offices by observing the lights inside the building, and they knew the number of personnel on duty at various hours of the day. Accordingly, another lock cylinder was installed until the original one was returned. A few months prior to the robbery, O'Keefe and Gusara surreptitiously entered the premises of a protective alarm company in Boston and obtained a copy of the protective plans for the Brinks building. After these plans were reviewed and found to be unhelpful, O'Keefe and Gusara returned them in the same manner. McGinnis previously had discussed sending a man to the United States Patent Office in Washington, D.C. to inspect the patents on the protective alarms used in the Brinks building. Considerable thought was given in every detail. When the robbers decided that they needed a truck, it was resolved that a new one needed to be stolen because a used truck might have distinguishing marks and possibly would not be in perfect running condition. Shortly thereafter, during the first week of November, a 1949 green Ford stake body truck was reported missing by a car dealer in Boston. In November and December 1959, the approach to the Brinks building and the flight over the getaway route was practiced to perfection. The months preceding witnessed approximately a half-dozen approaches to Brinks. None of these materialised because the members did not consider the conditions to be favourable. During these approaches, Costa, equipped with a flashlight for signalling the other men, was stationed on the roof of a tenement building on Prince Street overlooking Brinks. From this lookout post, Costa was in a position to determine better than the men below whether conditions inside of the building were favourable to the robbers. The last false approach took place the night before the robbery. At approximately 7 p.m, the men met in the Roxbury section of Boston and entered the rear of the Ford stake body truck. Banfield, the driver, was alone in the front. In the back were Pino, O'Keefe, Baker, Faherty, Maffey, Gusara, Michael Vincent Geoghegan, and Thomas Francis Richardson. At the time of the Brinks robbery, Geoghegan was on parole, having been released from prison in July 1943 after serving 8 years of a lengthy sentence for armed robbery and assault. Richardson had participated with Faherty in an armed robbery in February 1934. Sentenced to serve from 5 to 7 years for this offence, he was released from prison in September 1941. When questioned concerning his activities on the night, Richardson claimed that he was unsuccessfully looking for work and he had several drinks and then returned home. Geoghegan claimed that he spent the evening at home and did not learn of the robbery until the following day. Investigation relieved that Geoghegan, a labourer, had not gone to work on that day. During the trip from Roxbury, Pino distributed Navy-type pea coats and chauffeur's caps to the other 7 men in the rear of the truck. Each man was also given a weapon and a Halloween-type mask. Each carried a pair of gloves. O'Keefe wore crepe-soled shoes to muffle his footsteps, while the others wore rubber boots. As the truck drove past the Brinks offices, the robbers noticed that the lights were out on the Prince Street side of the building. This was in their favour. After continuing up the street to the end of the playground, which adjoined the Brinks building, the truck stopped. All but Pino and Banfield stepped out and proceeded to the playground to await Costa's signal. Costa, who had arrived at his lookout post previously, had arrived in a Ford sedan, which the members had stolen from behind the Boston Symphony Hall 2 days earlier. After receiving the go-ahead signal from Costa, the 7 armed men walked into the Prince Street entrance of Burke's. Using the outside door key they had previously obtained, the men quickly entered and donned their masks. The other keys in their possession enabled them to proceed to the second floor, where they took the 5 Brinks employees by surprise. When the employees were securely bound and gagged, they began looting. During this operation, a pair of glasses belonging to one of the employees was unconsciously scooped up with the other items and stuffed into a bag of loot. As the bag was emptied later that evening, the glasses were discovered and destroyed by the gang. The robbers' carefully planned route inside Burke's was interrupted only when the attendant in the adjoining Burke's garage sounded the buzzer. Before the robbers could take him prisoner, the garage attendant walked away. Although the attendant did not suspect that the robbery was taking place, this incident caused the criminals to work more swiftly. Before fleeing with the bag of loot, the 7 armed men attempted to open a metal box containing the payroll of the General Electric Company. They had brought no tools with them, however, and they were unsuccessful. Immediately upon leaving, they loaded the loot into the truck that was parked on Prince Street near the door. As the truck sped away with the 9 men and Costa departed in the stolen Ford sedan, the Brinks employees worked themselves free and reported the crime. Banfield drove the truck to the house of Maffey's parents in Roxbury. The loot was quickly unloaded and Banfield sped away to hide the truck. Geoghegan, who was on parole at the time, left the truck before it arrived at the home in Roxbury where the loot was unloaded. He was certain he would be considered a strong suspect and wanted to begin establishing an alibi immediately. While the others stayed at the house to make a quick count of the loot, Pino and Flaherty departed. Approximately 1.5 hours later, Banfield returned with McGuinness. Prior to this time, McGuinness had been at his liquor store. He was not with them when the robbery took place. The men who remained at the house of Maffey's parents soon dispersed to establish alibis for themselves. Before they left, approximately $380,000 was placed in a coal hamper and removed by Barker for security reasons. Pino, Richardson and Costa each took $20,000 and this was noted on a score sheet. Before removing the remainder of the loot from the house the next day, the men attempted to identify incriminating items. Extensive efforts were made to detect pencil markings and other notations on the currency that the criminals thought might be traceable to Brinks. Even fearing the new bills might be linked to the crime, McGuinness suggested a process of aging the new money in a hurry. On the night after the heist, O'Keefe and Gusara received $100,000 each from the robbery loot, but they put the entire $200,000 in the trunk of O'Keefe's car. Subsequently, O'Keefe left his car and the $200,000 in a garage on Blue Hill Avenue in Boston. During the period immediately following the Brinks robbery, the heat was on O'Keefe and Gusara. Thus, when he and Gusara were taken into custody by state authorities, O'Keefe got the word to McGuinness to recover his car and the $200,000. A few weeks later, O'Keefe retrieved his share of the loot. It was given to him in a suitcase that was transferred to his car from a car occupied by McGuinness and Banfield. Later, he counted the money and found that the suitcase contained $98,000. He had been shortchanged $2,000. O'Keefe had no place to keep such a large sum of money. He told the interviewing agents that he trusted Maffey so implicitly that he gave the money to him for safekeeping. Except for $5,000 that he took before placing the loot in Maffey's care, O'Keefe angrily stated that he never saw his share of the Brinks money again. While Maffey claimed that part of the money had been stolen from its hiding place and that the remainder had been spent on financing O'Keefe's legal defence in Pennsylvania, other men accused Maffey of blowing the money O'Keefe had entrusted in his care. Then there was the fact that so much deadwood was included, McGuinness, Banfield, Costa and Pino were not in the building when the robbery took place. O'Keefe was enraged that the pieces of the stolen Ford truck had been placed on the dump near his home and generally regretted having become associated with the several members. Before the robbery was committed, the participants had agreed that if anyone muffed, they would be taken care of. O'Keefe felt that most of the men had muffed. Talking to the FBI was his way of taking care of them all. On the 11th of January 1956, the United States Attorney at Boston authorized special agents of the FBI to file complaints charging the 11 criminals with 1. Conspiracy to commit theft of government property, robbery of government property, and bank robbery by force and violence by intimidation. 2. Committing bank robbery on January 17, 1950 and committing an assault on Brink's employees during the taking of the money. And 3. Conspiracy to receive and conceal money in violation of the bank robbery and theft of government property statutes. In addition, McGuinness was named in the 2 other complaints involving the receiving and concealing of the loot. 6 men, Baker, Costa, Geoghegan, Maffey, McGuinness and Pino, were arrested by FBI agents on the 12th of January 1956. They were held in lieu of bail, for each man amounted to more than $100,000. 3 of the remaining 5 were previously accounted for, O'Keefe and Gusara being in prison on other charges and Banfield passing away. Flaherty and Richardson fled to avoid apprehension and subsequently were placed on the list of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Their success for evading arrest ended abruptly on the 16th of May 1956 when FBI agents raided the apartment in which they were hiding in Dorchester, Massachusetts. At the time of their arrest, Flaherty and Richardson were rushing for 3 loaded revolvers that they had left on a chair in the bathroom of the apartment. The hideout was also found to contain more than $5,000 in coins. As a cooperative measure, the information gathered by the FBI in the Brinks investigation was made available to the District Attorney of Suffolk County, Massachusetts. On the 13th of January 1956, the Suffolk County Grand Jury returned indictments against the 11 members. O'Keefe was principal witness to appear before the state grand jurors. In July 1956, another significant turn of events took place. Stanley Gusara, who had been transferred to Massachusetts from Pennsylvania to stand trial, was placed under medical care due to weakness, dizziness and vomiting. On the afternoon of the 9th of July, he was visited by a clergyman. During his visit, Gusara got up from his bed and, in full view of the clergyman, slipped to the floor, striking his head. 2 hours later, he passed away. Examination revealed that the cause was a brain tumour and acute cerebral edema. O'Keefe and Gusara had been close friends for many years. When O'Keefe admitted his part in the Brink robbery to the FBI agents in January 1956, he told of his high regard for Gusara. As a government witness, he reluctantly would have testified against it. Only 8 members of the Brinks robbery remained to be tried. On the 18th of January 1956, O'Keefe had pleaded guilty to the armed robbery. The trial of these 8 men began on the morning of the 6th of August 1956 before Judge Felix Forte in the Suffolk County Courthouse in Boston. The defence immediately filed motions which would delay or prevent the trial. All were denied, and the impanelling of the jury began on the 7th of August. In the succeeding 2 weeks, nearly 1,200 prospective jurors were eliminated as the defence counsel used their 262 preliminary challenges. Another week passed, and approximately 500 more citizens were considered before the 14-member jury was assembled. More than 100 persons took the stand as witnesses for the prosecution and the defence during September 1956. The most important of these, Specs O'Keefe, carefully recited the details of the crime, clearly spelling out the role played by each of the 8 defendants. At 10:25 p.m. on the 5th of October 1956, the jury retired. Almost 4 hours later, the verdict had been reached. All were guilty. The men were sentenced by Judge Forte on the 9th of October 1956. Pino, Costa, Geoghegan, Faherty, Richardson and Baker received life sentences for robbery. 2-year sentences for conspiracy to steal, and sentences of 8 to 10 years for breaking and entering at night. McGinnis, who had not been at the scene on the night of the robbery, received a life sentence on each of the 8 indictments that charged him with being an accessory before the fact in connection with the robbery. In addition, McGinnis received other sentences of 2 years, 1.5 to 3 years, and 8 to 10 years. While action to appeal the convictions was being taken on their behalf, the 8 men were removed to the state prison at Walpole, Massachusetts. From their prison cells, they carefully followed their legal manoeuvres aimed at gaining them freedom. The record of the state trial covered more than 5,300 pages. It was used by the defence counsel in preparing a 294-page brief that was presented to the Massachusetts State Supreme Court. After weighing the arguments presented by the attorneys of the 8 convicted criminals, the State Supreme Court turned down the appeals on the 1st of July 1959, in a 35-page decision written by the Chief Justice. On the 16th of November 1959, the United States Supreme Court denied a request of the defence counsel for a writ of certiorari. In the end, the perfect crime did not have the perfect ending for the robbers.